Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, where we take up important articles of the day from the newspaper and discuss them in detail as per the demands of Civil Services exam. Articles covered today are displayed on your screen and their notes in PDF and Word format are provided in the description box down below. Without further ado, let us begin. Before start of today's discussion, let me remind you that prelims compass for all 5 subjects are available on our Telegram channel. The link of the Telegram channel has been provided in the description box below. Now starting off with the first article of the day, which appeared on page 14 of the Hindu newspaper. The article talks about that the wholesale price inflation has cooled down to the slowest pace in its 2 years, marking the deceleration for the 10th successive month. It is a record high since May 2022. Now the following article describes a few keywords such as wholesale price index, base effect, primary articles, fuel and power inflation, food inflation, and retail inflation. Now, to understand all these topics, we need to take a cursory overview of the topic inflation. Now, topics such as inflation targeting has been covered in the previous edition of the Daily News Simplified, while the trends of wholesale and consumer price index have been covered in the economic survey videos by Baswa sir. So please take a look for that. However, let us now take an overview of inflation. Now, what is inflation? Inflation refers to sustained rise in general level of prices over a period of time in the economy. This results in the fall in the value of money, that is, the purchasing power of the money reduces over a period of time. Similarly, there is a concept called deflation. Deflation is a general decline in prices which is often caused by reduction in supply of the money. This deflation can also be caused by a decrease in government, personal, or investment spending. It is the opposite of inflation. Deflation is bad because of the following reason. When prices start falling, that is, a deflation, people become less willing to spend and they postpone their purchase decisions. This is because when prices are falling, just sitting on cash becomes an investment with a positive yield. This decreases the demand in the economy and the prices they fall further. And thus, the economy slows down. People are less willing to borrow even for the productive investment because it has to be repaid in rupees which are worth more than the rupees borrowed. Thus, deflation increases unemployment since there is a lower level of demand in the economy, which may also lead to an economic depression. Now, deflation. Deflation is slowing down in the rate of inflation. It means there's an inflation in the economy, but the inflation percentage is decreasing. For example, let us consider the prices of onions. In the year 2013, the price of onion was 10 rupees, whereas in 2014, it increased to 11 rupees, signifying a 10% of inflation. In the following year of 2015, the price of onion again rose by 1 rupee. However, in terms of percentage, it constitutes a 9% inflation. Whereas in the year 2016, the cost of onion was 12.5 rupees, which constituted 4.2% of inflation. Thus, as you can see, the inflation remains positive in all these 3 years. However, in the absolute terms, it has reduced. So, we can see that the prices are rising, but the rate of change of prices, that is the inflation, is decreasing, hence signifying disinflation. We can understand the following concept with the help of this graph. In the first phase of the graph, you can see a general increase in level of prices. This means inflation. However, inflation being in the positive territory decreases. This is referred to as disinflation. When this inflation goes into the negative territory, it is called as a deflation. Now beyond inflation, there are other important terms that needs to be discussed. The first of the term is Qflation. It refers to general price rise over a sustained period of time, and this price rise is skewed to one or a small group of commodities. The second term is galloping inflation. It means that the inflation rate is very high, running in double digits or triple digits. It is also known as hopping inflation, jumping inflation, and running or runway inflation. The third term is hyperinflation. It refers to a large and accelerating inflation when prices rise of more than 50% or more in a month. And this phenomena is very rare. However, history is replete with examples such as Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in 2000s, and Venezuela's in 2010 have seen hyperinflation. The fourth term is creeping inflation. It refers to a gradual rise in prices over a long period of time. This kind of inflation is good for the economy and is also called as a mild inflation. The fifth term is bottleneck inflation, also known as a structural inflation. It occurs when the supply falls drastically, whereas the demand remains at a same level. Also, we need to discuss the inflation tax, which refers to a penalty for holding cash at the time of high inflation, and it results into erosion of value of money. The next term is stagflation. It refers to a situation when slow economic growth and high unemployment leads to stagnation, and it is accompanied by inflation. Further, there is an associated concept called Phillips curve. This curve establishes an inverse relation between inflation and unemployment. According to this graph, as the unemployment level decreases, we can see an increase in the levels of inflation. Now let us discuss the different types of inflation. The first type is called demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when there is an increase in the aggregate demand, categorized by four sectors of the economy, that is households, private, government, and foreign buyers. When these four sectors of the economy concurrently want to purchase more output than the economy can produce, it leads to an increase in level of prices. This excessive demand is also referred to as too much money chasing too few goods, and it usually occurs in the case of expanding economy. Demand pull inflation may be caused due to overexpansion of money supply, government reducing taxes and more spending, etc. The second type of inflation is referred to as cost push inflation. Cost push inflation basically means that prices have been pushed up by increase in costs of any of the four factors of production, that is land, labor, capital and entrepreneurship. Or there is a supply shortage which allows the producer to raise prices. This inflation occurs because there is an increase in cost of input rather than increase in demand. Cost push inflation may be caused by wage inflation, a monopoly situation during natural disasters as we saw during COVID crisis, or due to devaluation of exchange rates which leads to inflation in imported products, etc. Now, the question may arise that how do we measure inflation? The rate of inflation is measured based on price indices. These price indexes do not measure price of a single good, but rather they measure an average level of prices of a number of goods. This inflation is measured on a point-to-point basis. That is, the price in the current month are compared with the prices in the corresponding month of the previous year. For example, prices of the year April 2023 are compared with prices of April 2022. Now, there are various indexes that measure prices of a good. The two most important of them are Wholesale Price Index, that is WPI, or Consumer Price Index, that is CPI. The Wholesale Price Index, or the WPI, measures inflation at a wholesale rate, whereas the CPI measures inflation at a retail level. The Office of Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry calculates the Wholesale Price Index, whereas National Statistical Office under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation calculates CPI. The base year of WPI is 2011-2012, whereas the base year of CPI is 2012. The WPI is released on 14th of every month, whereas the CPI is released 2 days before, that is, on 12th of every month. The number of items covered in WPI is 697, which is more than number of items covered on the CPI, that is 299. There are categories and the respected weights in these indexes. For WPI, there are 3 categories. The first is primary articles, which approximately has 22.6% of weightage. The second category is manufactured products, which have a 64.2% weight. The third category is fuel and power, which has a 13.2% weight. While on the other hand, with respect to CPI, there are many categories. The first is food and beverage. It constitutes of 45.86% of weights, whereas pan, tobacco, and intoxicants have a 2.3% weight. The third category is clothing and footwear, which has a 6.53% weight. The housing sector constitutes a 10% weight in CPI. The fuel and light constitutes 6.84% weight, and it includes electricity, LPG, and kerosene. However, this category does not include petrol and diesel. The miscellaneous sector, which includes education, healthcare, transportation, and communication, constitutes a 28.32% weight. Now, what is the impact of increase in food items? The increase in prices of food items have a less bearing on WPI when you compare it with CPI. There's a reason which we will discuss in the next slide. Whereas, as far as weightage of fuel and power are concerned, WPI has a higher bearing on increase in cost of fuel and power, as it constitutes a higher percentage, that is 13.2%, as against CPI, which constitutes only 8% for fuel and power. Now, services, they are not included when you calculate WPI. However, on the other hand, services are included in the calculation of Consumer Price Index. Indirect tax are also excluded from WPI, while on the other hand, CPI includes indirect taxes. Now, CPI is also targeted by RBI, which is required to maintain a CPI rate within a band of 4%, having plus or minus 2% of tolerance rate, whereas WPI is not targeted by the RBI. Now moving on to the weightage given by food items in the respective WPI as well as CPI. Now WPI food index is a sub-index of wholesale price index. It is a combination of food articles from the primary articles basket in addition to food products from manufactured products basket. While on the other hand, the Consumer Food Price Index considers only food and beverage. The base year and methodology of calculation of Consumer Food Price Index is similar to Consumer Price Index. However, to calculate CFPI, we only consider the category of food and beverages, constituted 45.86% weightage under the CPI. Two items, that are non-alcoholic beverages, prepared meals, snacks and sweets, etc., are excluded while calculating CFPI. Thus, the remaining weightage decreases to 39%. Moving forward, there are other variants of Consumer Price Index. The first of which is Consumer Price Index for industrial workers. The base year of this index is 2016, which was revised recently from 2001. Now CPI for industrial workers is used for calculation of DNS allowances. The second variant of CPI is CPI for agricultural labours, which has a base year of 1986 and 87. The third variant is CPI for rural labours, having the same base year as agriculture labours. Currently, the Manrega wages are presently linked to CPI agricultural labours, and the government proposes that the wage should be linked to CPI of rural labourers. These three variants of CPI are published by Labour Bureau, which comes under the Ministry of Labour and Employment. Now, as we have heard the term headline and core inflation. What are these terms? Let us understand in this slide. The headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or WPI covering all the categories. On the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories such as food and fuel to measure the increase in prices of goods and services. Hence, a drastic fall in food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation to a large extent. However, core inflation will remain unaffected. Now there is a question of what to target. Do we target headline inflation or we target core inflation? Presently, RBI targets the CPI headline inflation and not the core inflation. In this regard, the economic survey of the year 2020-21 has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on number of reasons. It has recommended a greater focus on core inflation for following reasons. First, the headline inflation may take place due to volatility in crude oil and food prices, over which the RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks, etc., usually lead to increase in food prices. Secondly, at most of the time, the inflation in food commodities are transitory and may not require any policy action on behalf of RBI. The third reason is that if RBI tries to control the volatility in food commodities, it can prove counterproductive. Because, for example, to control inflation, rate of interest would have to increase. However, this will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which would lead to economic slowdown. The fourth factor is that to measure the inflation correctly, the weights assigned to the different categories of commodities should depend upon their share in household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. The share of food commodities in the household expenditure have declined since 2011. Yet, the CPI gives a weightage of almost 45% to food commodities, and this should ideally come down. Thus, Economic Survey recommends a greater focus on core inflation rather than just headline inflation. Additionally, we also hear about a term called base effect. What is base effect? Let us understand in the slide below. Base effect refers to impact of the rise in price level in the previous year over the corresponding price levels in the current year. As you can see, the rate of inflation refers to difference in prices over the period of 1 year divided by prices in the previous year, and this amount is multiplied by 100 to get a percentage. Now refer to the scenario to understand the base effect. In scenario 1, prices in May 2019 is 100 rupees for both scenarios. In first scenario, the price of good increases to 150 rupees, thus corresponding a 50% of inflation rate. Whereas 1 year later, in May 2021, the price again increased by 50 rupees. However, this constitutes a 33.33% of inflation rate. In the second scenario, over a course of 1 year, the price only increases by 10 rupees, thus constituting a 10% of inflation rate. However, again, in a course of 1 year, it increases by 90 rupees, reaching 200 rupees. But as we can see, the price levels in May 2020 is only 110 rupees. Thus, over a period of time, this inflation constitutes a 81.81% increase, as against only 33.3% increase in scenario 1. This reflects that the higher the value of base in the denominator, lower is the rate of inflation, whereas if the base or the denominator has a lower value, the rate of inflation would go higher, and now this is called the base effect. Now let us discuss the effect of inflation. The first impact is on creditors and debtors. Inflation represents the degradation of value of money. It negatively impacts the creditors who lends money, and it positively benefits those who borrow money, that are debtors. The impact of inflation on interest rates, that is the real interest rate, decreases due to rise in inflation. Suppose a bank A gives loan at a 10% interest. Now inflation in the economy is 5%. The actual rate of interest to be paid by borrowers will only be the difference, that is the 5%. The impact on investment. Moderate rate of inflation, that is about 4%, indicates higher demand, and thus it leads to an increase in investment in the economy. However, if there is a very high rate of inflation, it could lead to macroeconomic instability, thus will reduce the level of investments. The impact on saving. An increase in inflation would mean that holding money is not a good option. Impact on tax liability. Increase in inflation increases the direct tax liability of an individual. The indirect tax liability also increases due to inflation. The impact on inflation rate. In general, inflation tends to depreciate a currency. Since inflation can be equated with a decrease in money's buying power, as a result, the countries who experience high inflation tend to also see that their currencies weaken relative to other currencies. Now, to conclude, let us discuss two previous year questions. The previous year question of 2021. With reference to Indian economy, demand pull inflation can be caused by increase of which of the following? From the above discussion, we can conclude that expansionary policies, fiscal stimulus, and higher purchasing power increase the aggregate demands in the economy, thus they lead to demand pull inflation. From the above discussion, it is clear that the option A is the right answer. Now, PYQ of the year 2020. Consider the following statements. Statement 1. The weightage of food in consumer price index is higher than that of wholesale price index. Now this statement, as we have discussed, is correct. Statement 2. The WPI does not capture changes in the price of services which the CPI does. Now this statement also is correct. Statement 3. Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as a key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Now this statement is incorrect because RBI has now adopted CPI as a key measure of inflation. Which of the following statements given above is or are correct? From the above discussion, we can conclude that option A here is also the right answer. Now, with regards to the ongoing discussion, we have discussed inflation and associated terms. Other important terms such as stagflation and skewflation were also discussed. Now, measures of inflation and various indexes such as CPI and WPI were discussed following that. We also saw the difference between headline and core inflation as well as understood the concept of base effect. To conclude, we also understood the effects of inflation on the economy. Now, the above discussion has helped us to solve two previous year questions for prelims. To conclude, we can say that the inflation remains a very important topic as far as prelims is concerned. Now, as the prelims are only 40 days away, it is important that we go through these concepts. Now, moving on to the second article of the day, which appeared in the Hindus, page 13. This article describes that the SpaceX, a private sector party in US, has postponed the first test flight of Starship, that is the most powerful rocket ever built. The Starship is bigger and more powerful than the NASA's own Space Launch System or SLS. The importance of this spaceship can be gauged by the fact that Starship will ferry astronauts to the moon in 2025 as a part of Artemis 3rd mission of NASA. Now, private sector participation in general has been a topic of discussion in India's space sector for some time. The importance of space sector can be gauged by the fact that in GS paper 3, awareness in the fields of IT, space, computers, robotics, nanotech, and issues related to intellectual property rights has been mentioned. As you can see, in the previous year question of 2019, in GS paper 3, there was a question on India's plan to have its own space station and how will it benefit our space program. Similarly, in the year 2016, we were asked to discuss India's achievement in the field of space science and technology and how application of this technology has helped India in its socio-economic development. Whereas in prelims in the year 2018, a question was asked on India's satellite launch vehicles. Therefore, today's scope of discussion will cater around the status of India's space industry. Moving ahead, we will discuss the need for private sector participation. In addition, we will also discuss the challenges that are associated with the private sector participation in space sector. Moving forward, we will also chart a road ahead for increasing the private sector participation in the space sector. Now, let us understand the status of India's space industry. India's space industry is driven by a public sector. India's space program is also one of the world's most well-developed space program and is driven by a state-owned agency, that is Indian Space Research Organization or ISRO. The space industry has a high economic potential, which can be seen by the fact that at a global level it is estimated to be of size of US dollars 360 billion, whereas India accounts for 2% share of this market, that comes around $7 billion. The India space sector is projected to increase at a rate of 48% over the next 5 years. It will reach $50 billion. However, there is a limited participation in satellite and ground-based services. In global space market, the rocket and satellite launch services, the area in which ISRO specializes, accounts for only 5% share, whereas the satellite and ground-based services account for 95% market share, where the participation of Indian enterprises are limited. At present, the government drives a certain level of participation by the Indian private sector, which are limited in the rocket and satellite launch-based services segment. However, enhanced private sector participation will be necessary to penetrate this satellite and ground-based services segments. Now, what are the activities that a private sector participant can undertake in the space industries? There are many activities. The first activity that a private sector participant can undertake is production of components and subsystems of launch vehicles and spacecrafts. These activities include integration and testing of spacecrafts and space launches vehicles. The second is space launch of spacecraft on board a launch vehicle, which includes establishment and operations of launch infrastructure. The third is provision of space-based services, which includes establishment and operations of ground stations and also includes operation, control, and station keeping of spacecrafts. The fourth activity that a private sector participant can undertake is launch of space-based application, which uses satellites for Earth observation, remote sensing, navigation, communication, for information and broadcasting services. Now, why is there a need to encourage private sector participation in space sector? The first reason is to cater to growing demands. As ISRO alone can't cater to the rising demand for space-based application and services within India, almost every sector, starting from agriculture to transport, now wants satellite data and space technology to draw their future strategy. It has been estimated that ISRO would need to increase its present size by 10 times in order to be able to cater to this increasing demand. The second reason is to fulfill ISRO's strategic objectives. As currently, a lot of ISRO's resources are being consumed by routine activities. This causes delays in completing its strategic objectives. If private companies take over these routine activities, ISRO will be able to focus more on strategic programs like R&D activities, exploration missions, and human spaceflight programs. Also, private sector participation is necessary for India's geopolitical objectives. The availability and demonstration of emerging technologies have a great significance in defining modern day geopolitics. Thus, Given the current geopolitical situation of the country and security threats that it faces, growth in space sector can help the country gain leverage over the others. The third reason is to increase India's share in global space market. India's space sector has the potential to capture close to 9% of the global market share by the year 2030, and this cannot be achieved without private sector's participation. The fourth objective is to secure space capabilities and make them more robust. This can be done by distributing them across different satellites and spacecrafts so that business continuity is unaffected even if an adversary manages to disable one or more of our satellites. The more the critical function is, the more the level of diversity is required. The fourth reason is to expand the satellite based services. As of August 2021, India has only 3 lakh customers, whereas there are 45 lakh customers in US and 20 lakh customers in the European Union. Private sector can facilitate the development of a cost-effective product or a service, thus will create a large base for new consumers. There are other factors as well which demand for private sector participation. These are need to attract innovation and cutting-edge technology, increase competitiveness in the sector, creation of job opportunities, and realizing the vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat, as well as development by private sector will reduce the dependence on taxpayers' money to fund space missions. However, private sector participation comes along with a long list of challenges. What are these challenges? Let us explore in the next slide. The first challenge is conflict of interest, as ISRO acts as a both regulator and an operator. This conflict of interest is likely to manifest in dispute resolutions between a private player and ISRO entities. The second challenge is the procedural hurdles, as companies have often cited that there are multiplicity of approvals required, which creates procedural ambiguity and acts as a barrier. For example, in the year 2017, a US based company called RAU'S has announced a $500 million satellite communication systems in India. But this company is yet to receive any approvals or are given an expected timeline. The third challenge is the lack of clarity on the level of private involvement. There is a lack of clarity regarding the definition and scope of private involvement in the space sector, given that the government still considered the domain in space as too crucial for national interest and to allow the private sector participation. The fourth challenge is absence of a coherent policy. There is an absence of coherent policy framework at the national level, which could provide support and guidelines to technology manufacturing businesses such as tax rebates and other advantages of operating in a special economic zone. However, only in this month, a cabinet has approved India's space policy for 2023. Now, the contours of this space policy will be covered later on. The fifth challenge is the limited technological advancements. As ISRO works on a traditional vendor-supplier model, most of the intellectual property rights are owned by the ISRO itself. This has hindered the technological advancement of Indian companies. The other challenge includes monopolistic trends that a private sector participation can encourage. As space technology is too expensive and needs heavy investment, this creates a high entry barrier for new players. The kind of lucrative power is available only with selected rich corporates and thus leads to monopolistic trends in the sector. Also, the social welfare may take a back seat. The space program by ISRO has always worked on applications like remote sensing, tracking of land use, resource mapping, which are meant to enhance social welfare. However, the private companies have a more profitable interest than developing solutions that cater to immediate socio-economic demands of the country. Now, let us explore what is the way forward to encourage the participation of private sector parties. The road ahead includes The first is providing a regulatory clarity. The purpose of regulation must be to ensure compliance with India's international obligations to ensure safety and cover liabilities and standardization. An improved regulatory environment will mean few barriers of entry for private firms. Also, there is a need for legislation to provide procedural clarity and facilitate ISRO's partnership with industries and entrepreneurs. Rekindling the debate on draft space activities bill would provide a good head start. The second is to create an independent regulator. By creating an independent regulator to govern ISRO and its affiliate as well as a private sector firm can help instill confidence among the private sector players. Separate license can be awarded for different classes of launch vehicles, orbits, as well as services. The third way is to incentivize the private companies. By opening up of ISRO testing facilities such as ISRO Propulsion Complex at Mahendragiri in Karnataka will help private sector companies build satellites and test rockets, which will reduce the cost and increase incentives for the firms to build an operational spacecraft. The fourth is to bring foreign direct investment reforms. The government can consider implementing the telecom model for FDI, which allows investment up to 49% under the automatic route, as well as investments for more than 50% under the government approval model. There are other steps that can encourage the private sector participation, such as creation of an IP centric policy to create reforms where local industries can invest in building their own intellectual property and products that can match global standards. Further, by enabling a level playing field for the private sector through burden sharing between public and private actors. Also, there's a need for collaboration and integrated conversation between various stakeholders in the space sector who need to come together to help establish a suitable framework for space policy and governance. So, in this above discussion, we have concluded that the private sector participation is necessary to meet increasing demands as well as fulfill strategic and geopolitical objectives of India. This can be done by regulatory clarity, creating an independent regulator, providing incentives to private companies, reforms in foreign direct investment, and collaboration between various stakeholders.